Hello there, everyone. Good morning, I should say. Nearly on the precipice of December. It's getting to that festive time of year. Welcome to the webinar today. We are focusing very much on invoicing and specifically the Xero integration. So a really exciting one for me today. We're going to be going through a lot of bits and pieces, particularly troubleshooting items, particularly clarifying some of the syncing items that operate between both WorkflowMAX and Xero. There are some changes from old versus new that I'm really keen to go through. I'm also going to go at slightly rogue today and actually talk about easy bills and some of the integration tips and hints around that as well. I know there's been quite a bit of content released and there was a webinar on the easy bills piece, but there's one or two elements that really relate to the invoicing processes for many businesses that I'm really excited to go on. So I'll touch more on that in a minute. Just waiting for everyone to slowly trickle in. Again, thank you so much for joining. I appreciate it's a really busy time of year for many of us. So particularly leading to Christmas. So hopefully everyone's got a coffee or a festive eggnog, whatever your beverage of choice is, and is ready to go. So thank you so much for sharing some of your precious time with me on Thursday. Um, we'll just wait a few extra moments for everyone to sink in. We'll probably kick off just with a little bit of housekeeping as well. So just so everyone knows, this session is being recorded. So the WorkflowMAX team will distribute the recording afterwards or provide a link directly on the website and through your little handy shortcut option, which is directly on the WorkflowMAX little question bar. So webinars in there, which will get you a quick link if you can all see that down there. So I think we're getting ready to kick off. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Dan, and I am the founder of Set Up My Systems. So really quick background on me. Many of you will know me from the quite a few other webinars that I've done with the team. I've been implementing WorkflowMAX, both the old and the new, for the last 10 years. I absolutely love the product and what it can do in solving small business problems. So today you'll notice that I try and relate to a lot of industry challenges, industry examples as well. These sessions are really built to empower you as a business owner or business manager, get more out of the product and the tool. So again, you're welcome to contact me afterwards and ask the team questions. We do have the team active on Q&A around us. So the Q&A box is open right now. Please feel free to jump in. We've got the beautiful team, Linnell, Kwang, and Joe joining us in the background. So all questions will be answered there. And I will try and get to some questions as we go as well. So as mentioned, a bit of housekeeping. You have to jump off early. Please don't be bothered. We will be recording this. And hopefully everyone's ready to settle in. There will be elements today that I will step through a little bit quicker than usual. But I'll touch on those. And again, it's being recorded, so you can revert back to it and obviously ask questions as we go. Just before we quickly jump into it, I just want to raise sort of the flag that, remember, our WorkflowMAX website has a plethora of resources there available to you. Obviously, webinars, recordings, support options. My favorite, though, in terms of getting resource content is directly in that little question bar. So those that didn't see it or those that don't know, here's the question bar at the top. We can obviously search the knowledge base there. We can obviously contact us. We can obviously review the help center and other troubleshooting guides. Really handy content in there, particularly about today's subject matter as well with the Xero integration. Obviously got the Academy, upcoming feature releasing, product updates, and the webinars as well. The product updates are really, really great, guys. You get to hear directly from the main team themselves, Mac, Galti, and all Ryan and other team members. So really, really cool. So today, we're talking everything that is WorkflowMAX integration to Xero. So if you do have other accounting products that you're using, sorry, I'm not going to be touching too much on that today. Again, you are more than welcome to reach out afterwards and ask questions if you have any third-party integrations or anything else. But today we'll be very much focusing on the WorkflowMAX and Xero piece. We'll be going through, obviously, some of the key integration items that sync both ways, some items that only sync one way and vice versa. We're going through some general setup and tips and tricks there. Invoicing, of course, is a really big one for us. Differences between premium and standard user licenses. Generally speaking, premium is awesome, guys. There's one or two things that are still to be released, but premium itself, in terms of that, in terms of capacity planning and obviously the features you get specific to invoicing, are really handy. So we'll touch on that as well. Payments as well. So update to payments more recently and syncing both ways. which is really, really cool as well. General troubleshooting with invoice numbering. Just so everyone knows, there was a release actually done in the last, I believe in the last 24 hours. Just some minor troubleshooting stuff that with invoice number sequencing when there was a duplicate that's detected, particularly if you've been doing an invoice number sequence generated from WorkflowMAX, but then have changed to Xero invoice number sequencing with the same prefix. Some users may have run into error there. A lot of it was based on user error, but some of it was based on obviously computation error as well through the API. So there has been an update there. But again, we'll touch on some troubleshooting items today and go through premium. So to get us kicked off, just some really basics. Now, obviously, we'll be starting at a really low level and building to more technical detail as we go. Client details, obviously, is one of those things. Client details specifically do sync across and do update as well if the correct settings have been provisioned. You notice there's a direct reference to everything except email addresses. Now, one of the things to note is that the email relationship, so when you're raising an invoice, and obviously based on your settings, the email address is directly aligned with the contact that's on the invoice. So if you are trying to email a customer or have that email directly sync across to Xero, just a reminder that the contact is what holds the relationship for your email address. So I'll show in a moment in the invoicing where you can make sure you've got the correct contact. And obviously, if you're updating that contact details and email on that contact in WorkflowMAX, assuming you've got the correct settings enabled, it will also update in Xero. Purchase orders, obviously, purchase order bills only. So when we say purchase invoices, we're not talking about the purchase orders themselves. We're talking about the bills that you receipt against purchase orders in WorkflowMAX. They will then sync across, of course, to Xero as you go. Payments, another big one. So we'll be touching on the payments piece. Payments do now sync both ways, which is really cool. So if you're in an environment that, say, is on premium in your subscription, you've got reoccurring invoices being generated from Xero and syncing across to WorkflowMAX, you can apply a payment either way and it will actually update either way now as well, which is really cool. Again, that's not going to be relevant to every workflow. In fact, quite a lot of workflows will have quite a relatively simple invoicing and reconciliation process. And we'll touch on some more examples there and timesheeting as well. So some of the things that doesn't get put across. So again, with purchase orders, everyone, when we create a purchase order against a job and we issue that purchase order, that is not getting sent across to Xero. What is being sent across is when we receipt the invoice against a purchase order, whether it's a partial receipted invoice or a fully receipted purchase order, I should say. You'll note that obviously with the new WorkflowMAX, we've got the ability to do things like receipting stock, which will have a corresponding invoice, and we can have a purchase order that say might be an open purchase order for a few $1,000s. And I'll actually bring up a purchase order example really shortly and go through that. The other part there is job costs. So our job costs on a job will not sync across either way. That's something that's really important. So if you've got job costs that are sitting there, which might be representative of some OpEx costs or operational expenses you have in Xero, that's okay. They don't sync either way. It's only when you put a bill against a purchase order does that bill get sent across to Xero. And WIP, work in progress. So I will go through that work in progress piece probably a little bit more detail just when we go through. I do want to kind of work our way back from setup, but work in progress does not interact with Xero whatsoever. So many of us have a definition of work in progress that might be different to others. Work in progress is one of those really interesting subjects about how to handle WIP. Where do we report on WIP? And typically your accountant or financial advisor will give you their preferences for how they would like you to handle WIP, typically as a balance sheet movement. But again, nothing from a work in progress will sync either way. We will be going through these obviously in a little bit more detail, but I wouldn't mind actually circling back on some of the really key setup items, then coming back through some of these basic steps and basic workflows in terms of what syncs and what doesn't. So I'm going to jump straight through to setup and then go through to configuring our Xero setting. So coming across, you'll notice here that I'm just in a demo environment at the moment. We do have quite a little bit of demo data in. Some of it is a little bit random, a little bit of festive cheer in there as well. So if you do notice anything that's a little bit odd, don't be concerned. It is just a demo file. So what you want to do is when you're setting up the Xero integration, you will be going directly into settings. So business settings, or reminder that little handy cog on the top right-hand corner. Once you get there, you'll want to click on integrations and you'll have set up integrations. Now, I have set up this integration before, and I will do a reset up shortly. But what you would have appearing here is an option to sync or set up your Xero integration. You select your appropriate Xero organization, hit yes, and then follow the prompts. Now, the beauty is of when you're filling out that detail, it's very similar to what the layout and the screen options are as we see here. So if at any time you need to go in and update your Xero settings, as many of us will do from time to time, these options and questions are essentially exactly the same as what you'll see when you first set up Xero and that Xero WorkflowMAX integration. So coming through, obviously, you'll want to, with the default settings, look at our income and cost of sale account. Now, everyone, just touching on our Xero integration, we're going to start going into a little bit more depth now. By default, WorkflowMAX integrates with Xero at 3 different levels. So the first level is what we see in front of us now, which is a default income and cost of sale. So what that's doing is every time we raise an invoice, if I have just set up the default integration in terms of the levels, I'll be sending everything to our GL file as 200 sales. Cost of sales, whenever I see a bill against a purchase, that's then going against that particular expense code or cost of sale code, which is 300 purchases. Now, again, many of us will have a more detailed relationship between where we want to send invoices and bills in terms of our general ledger. And I'll go through that just shortly. That would be the next step after we go through the default settings. But we do want to set the default account and default cost of sale. And I'll go through why shortly with the hierarchy. Tax. So default tax type for many of us will be GST on income, GST on expenses. That may not be the case. These will sync directly from your settings, obviously, that you've established in Xero. So many of us will have more than these options we see in front of us. That's okay. Again, the setup provisioning for both income, cost of sales, so your general ledger, as well as your tax types are all orientated from what's been set up directly there in our Xero file. Tracking categories. For those that don't know, tracking categories are a beautiful way of reporting and getting performance reporting from Xero without having to have an overly complicated general ledger. If you want to know more about tracking categories, happy to reach out, contact me directly. But just for the purposes of the demo, we've got tracking category region, so sales COGS by region, and obviously demographic here as well. So these are 2 really basic examples. We've got region, and there might be some different options. You might have Queensland, New South Wales, state-based regions, and then you might have sales representatives, which represent maybe north, south, east, or west as a reporting category. Tracking categories is really, really interesting subject to get into. If you haven't used it, definitely recommend you take a look. There's so many options there for getting more out of your default reporting directly from Xero. Now, the next part here, when you go through your setup or updating your setup, as we're doing now, is the communication between clients and suppliers and when we update details in Xero. Now, for many of us and for many of the organizations I speak to, never is the option. I'll explain why. Because many of us will have clients that on a project or a job, I should say, will have a default contact for that job. So professional services industries, trade services industries, you'll have a main go-to purchase person like the client lead, the purchasing officer if it's government entity or mining entity, whatever the case is. Now, what's really cool here though is if it's not the case, and quite often small business environments might have an option here to select maybe only when uploading invoices, if there is going to be a lot of subtle changes between, the default contact or maybe the address or something else that's aligned with that client, that's obviously an option you can pick there. Seldom do I ever see a setup that uses this because quite often when you set up a client or a supplier, naming conventions, addresses aren't changing. And typically there's a nice process there for updating in terms of your finance process. So for instance, we don't necessarily want, for instance, our ops teams or sales teams or people that are driving our operational items to be changing and updating details, client supply details, contact details without a form of control from accounts and finance. So that's a genuine reason why quite often never is the option. Again, your workflow will dictate whether or not these other 2 are useful. Something to note as well is, again, if you've selected never, or maybe if you've selected every time client supply details are updated, and then you've ticked this button, you'll see here we've got this option of updating contact person, email, uploading invoices. So again, by default, Xero has a default contact that is aligned with the client or supplier, or contact and customer and supplier, I think the terminology is, sorry, in Xero. Now, if we tick that button, it means that every time there is a job allocated with a new contact, we raise an invoice or associated bill, the client or supplier details, the contact will update and change that default or primary contact. So again, this is one that isn't often ticked in many environments. And the reason is quite often you will have businesses, or you might have scenarios where you are having multiple different contacts for job specific purposes, but then accounts typically are accounts, typically default email address, etc. Keep in mind in Xero and contacts, if you've got multiple contacts, you've got that option of adding contacts. Again, unticking this button here if you don't wish to update contacts or update the default contact every time client or supplier details are updated. You do have the option of adding additional contacts directly in Xero itself. So we'll go to edit. And then when we add other people, we can just by default note to include people in the emails that are sent. So particularly if your workflow is to send invoices directly to customer from Xero, and you're approving invoices or issuing invoices directly from WorkflowMAX to sync to Xero for to approve and send directly from Xero to customer, you can then have some options and configuration around additional contacts that you'd like to include every time you email an invoice to a client or have received a bill directly from supplier. Now, this is another workflow contextual item that we'll touch on. And again, this is very much workflow dependent. So what this is saying that every time we are exporting an invoice to Xero, we're defaulting that invoice to be received as a draft invoice in Xero or approved. Now, again, this is workflow dependent. Quite a few of us will be in organizations where potentially a project manager, a project lead, or maybe a warehouse manager who completes the job. The process is they review the timesheets, they review the quote, they check the job, they approve the invoice in WorkflowMAX as an example, but they don't send it to customer. Finance or accounts picks that up directly as a draft or an approved invoice, typically as a draft. They go, yep, check and balance, check job. We're happy with that. We send the invoice to customer directly from Xero. Now, it's a very specific workflow for a very specific business context. Obviously, you might be in an environment where the same person, as a small business, same person that does the job, approves the invoice, sends the invoice, might be the same person or a group of people we trust. We can always set by default for that invoice to be approved and sent. And again, that approved is also handy if you are sending your invoices directly from WorkflowMAX, which will be many of us, particularly with the configuration that you can build into your invoice templating in WorkflowMAX. Really, really handy option, particularly if you don't want to go back to Xero and then have to approve it and then mark it as sent. It will just get sent as approved. Now, another one that can cause a little bit of confusion from time to time is the invoice numbering sequence. I do recommend that if you are changing the invoice number sequence from Xero to WorkflowMAX, that you triple check up the top here your specific settings. I'll go into the general settings and show you where to check that. In fact, I might do it now because we're kind of on the subject. So if you're changing the number where you get the number sequence from, just keep in mind in WorkflowMAX in our general settings. So again, cog business settings, general, edit number sequences is where you want to go. This is determining. So if I've selected that invoice numbers are generated from WorkflowMAX, what you want to do is check what the last or next invoice number is, the prefix, and make sure that the next invoice, so you do this end of day or end of week, whatever the case is obviously not going to create a duplicate with what was the last invoice that was created directly in Xero. So if you are changing between WorkflowMAX generated invoice numbers or Xero, just be really conscious of that when you go through as well, that can be just an item that causes some errors to be thrown. So back to our integrations, coming back, obviously from a setup perspective, we are scrolling down. Now, this by default is quite important, particularly if you do send invoices to customers directly from Xero. This section here is more important, particularly if you do use phases. So phases is a really, really awesome piece of kit. If you haven't looked at it yet, phases is a beautiful way of grouping together tasks and costs, but the workflow application of phases is quite dynamic. So I won't go into it in too much detail, but by default, you'll generally know that whether or not on an invoice you like to show the individual tasks and costs, or the job or miscellaneous invoice total, so just a total, maybe referencing sort of the description or job name, or the phases. And you'll notice that when I circle here, we'll have some different options that are presented. So when you are invoicing, you can actually go in and change this before you invoice a certain customer, come in, change it. Wouldn't recommend doing that, but that does happen in some environments where 99% of their clients, they might invoice off individual tasks and costs, but then they've got 3 clients they invoice off phase. One of the things that you do need to remember, so if you are invoicing, say, as many of us will, individual tasks and costs, we've got these obviously code references in for the job summary. Now, these obviously will appear as a line item in Xero on the actual invoice. So just a reminder that client order number, you'd probably want to put a reference here for client order number. So when people look at an invoice, they go client order number and they see the scripting that comes through here. Obviously that merge field reference, and conversely, we'll put in job number and go from there. So again, this is really particular if you do send or generate invoices from WorkflowMAX, but then send them through to Xero to be sent to the customer from Xero, not the other way around. You'll typically, if you're sending to customers directly from WorkflowMAX, you either use the default or a custom invoice template. Now, these options here, take note, depending on your workflow, show task description may or may not be useful, show task for $0 value, show cost note, $0 value. Again, depending on workflow context there, could be useful to you or otherwise. Now, particularly on premium, you'll notice you'll have or on premium, you notice that you've got the ability to invoice payments or payments to sync back, I should say. Now, this is an automatic setting, so it means that when you mark as reconciled or mark payment in Xero, that invoice payment will come back to the invoice that you've generated or that has been sent previously. Now, if you are one of those few customers or several customers, I should say, that do reoccurring invoices from Xero, so you're generating your reoccurring invoices in the reference field, which I'll show you. You put the job number in, it appears against that job directly in WorkflowMAX. You can mark payment either way now. So you can reconcile payment in Xero, mark as paid, or you can mark the payment in WorkflowMAX, and that will sync and reference both ways now. The key point about this automatic update, though, is some businesses prefer not to enable that for their different workflow drivers. Now, if you don't, you've got the ability here at the top to import payments. So just a reminder, if that is you, that you've got that option there. Many of us, though, if we've enabled a premium, we want to automatically import payments. That's all good. Now, similar contextual workflow elements to what we discussed with invoicing, sales invoicing, I should say. Purchase order bills, very much the same, very much dependent on whether or not you do want to export those as draft or approved. That approval process is really, really interesting in terms of whether or not your business and workflow prefers to have that soft check and balance. So typically, if you've got a step where somebody's raising or applying a bill, you want to check it in Xero first, say somebody in accounts or a business owner, to then approve it. So then it can be scheduled for a payment run via ABA file or directly. Now, similar to obviously when that bill's pushed across, there's quite a bit of information that we can push across here. And obviously that sequencing, this will appear as directly as content in a line item above any of the content that's in that bill. Now, that's obviously something to go through and customize based on your workflow preferences. You'll notice Xero invoice import, automatically import invoices from Xero. Now, this is probably one I do want to just take a moment on. Again, something to be treated with caution, really driven by your workflow. So take a moment to sort of think about that in your workflow context. It is one of the best features about WorkflowMAX is that you can sync invoices directly from Xero to WorkflowMAX. So particularly if you do retainer assignments, you might be doing monthly maintenance, you might be doing a marketing agency, doing retainer work, or an accounting practice, bookkeeping practice, etc. There's quite a few options here. So if we select for all invoices, keep in mind that will be for all invoices. And we've got some options here as well. So first one, automatically import invoices from Xero. So you notice here that the invoice against the job, the reference number is what's required here. So this is the default setting to go, yes, we want invoices to come across between Xero to WorkflowMAX. This button here is to create a new job when no current job matches the Xero reference field. Now, for many of us, that's a no, because we should only typically be creating invoices when there's an actual job to align it with. There might be some ad hoc invoices that you just on the fly, say if you're a job shop, so you're manufacturing, fabrication, or you just do a high volume of jobs, sometimes a job will come in and you just literally send out an invoice because they're buying something from the shelf or whatever the case is. You raise an invoice, send it. That might be an example when you tick that button because then it'll come in, create a job, and go from there. Otherwise, we'll just sit in an invoice against the client when you go to your client reference screen, which is here. So again, if you don't tick that button directly on a client, you'll just have a reference to the invoice there, but there won't be a corresponding job that's created conversely as well. Now, the other option there is obviously excluding invoices with no references, so will be allocated to the client. So that's the part I was mentioning before. So just be cautious based on your workflow requirements, what you really need there. And the other one just to take note of is that invoice summary. So the Xero invoice is just by default something I put in. You might want a specific word track or something else. That's the invoice summary that will get sent through from that invoice back through to WorkflowMAX. So that will come up as a line item essentially in that invoice in WorkflowMAX. So that's a little bit of detail there. So touch on some of these elements that we've gone through. Obviously, we've touched on payments. We've touched on timesheets. You'll notice here, if I actually come through to my Xero example, I've got a few ones here that we've already done earlier. So to mark a invoices paid, we've just got this test that's running here. We might have raised an invoice. We come in. This invoice here has a payment against it. We can see that we've added a payment down the bottom, or that payment has directly been receipted. And it's saying that this payment's been receipted directly there. We can update bank account and other reference if need be. That invoice and that detail automatically gets sunk through. And again, we've got all that there as well, and that payment. So that's been marked as fully paid as well. So that will sync both ways. So just to raise a invoice against this particular job as well, I'll actually show you the steps to be able to do that. So again, we'll just do new progress invoice. We'll just do it off quoted value, send that to the customer. So touching on some of those things that we've mentioned earlier, obviously client PO number, job description if it's relevant. I'm using the example that we're raising the invoice and sending it through from Xero. We've come through, we've obviously got that's actually replicating a credit. So this is actually a handy one. I might show this first actually. So this is actually saying that we're actually crediting some Xero invoices that had come through. And so what I'm doing is actually showing you essentially what is a credit note or a discount process. So if you were to do this, you're showing that this is kind of the existing balance. I won't invoice those, but say if I had a credit that I needed to raise or a discount, those can be raised as a negative line item. So I've actually dragged through those pre-existing invoices there, and I've got an option to add those as a credit or otherwise. Now, I, for instance, just want to invoice, say, $100 for this item, go from there, cool, save and approve. Now, again, because I'm approving that, that will then go into my Xero log. We come in here, we then go into obviously invoicing. And we've got our quoted here. And we'll double check our, obviously our Xero export log. We can see that this one's pending here. And in a few moments that will sync through. Just a reminder that you've got the ability to view invoices that have directly been synced here as well. So we'll trigger and open up that Xero screen. So just a really handy reference there. And what we'll have if we come to our Xero file, come into invoices. Now syncing happens, I think every 2 times with the API, 2 times every minute or so. So typically that will come across. Now we've got some others that have come through as well. That's there. And again, that sync log is one of those ones that's really handy one to test as well. So that's now been synced across. You'll notice actually just a quick point while we're on this screen, if you do have a failed log and you've got a failed invoice that you just want to get rid of and not retest, at the moment we've got the ability to test and resync. Coming soon will be an option, I believe, around here, depending on what vibe the developers are in on the day, which will be just hide or eliminate any perpetually failed sync options. So then you've essentially got the ability just to wipe those clear as well, which is really good. So any ones that you just don't wish to sort of have existing in the log and to hide, you'll have that option to get rid of them there. Awesome. So probably just touching on some of the other elements just back on that invoice. So if I come into, and for those that don't know, actually, there was an update to the search, global search field, particularly if you're searching jobs. Now archive jobs and more information is presenting here. So I actually really love the global search feature now. It actually presents more information than what was. So do check that out. Again, it's probably more recently in the last 2 weeks. So if you haven't had a play with it recently, be able to search archive jobs in there is really, really cool. Just coming back to this particular job, we've obviously got that quoted value, which is 110. Coming through, we've got that there. Now I can add payment. So I'll say it's $100. I'll put in the reference number there. Excellent. And that's this one. We'll mark that one as approved. Again, we've actually set it up so it's marked to come through as draft. Now we can view that. And again, your workflow, this marking payment may not be for every workflow. Quite often, a lot of businesses will simply just raise an invoice in WorkflowMAX, send it through to Xero, check and approve if required, send through to customer, and then reconcile the payment once it's receipted in, and to be able to go from there. Now, if we wait an extra 30 seconds or so, and I'll jump onto another one to show you how that looks, but we've obviously will have our subtotal summarized there as well below. So again, that payment with the API sync, it will be once or twice every minute or so, and that will come across. Also a reminder that if you are in your Xero invoices and you do reconcile, or if your workflow is to, for instance, mark as payment, you've got the ability there to quite simply mark a payment as you normally would, and that payment reference will actually come back directly to the invoice as well. So this one here, we add payment, 137, we go boom, selected account, business bank account, add payment date. If I come back actually to this job, I'll show you some examples of what we did just a little bit earlier, so you've got the reference of what that looks like. And again, you'll have obviously a reference there to that's the Xero invoice that got pushed across. We'll have, scroll down and we'll have there. And again, you'll have that reference of paid down the bottom. So again, that sync comes both ways now. So really handy based on workflow requirements. One of the things I will go through as well is that quite a few of us will actually export timesheets through to Xero. So really important that particularly if you pay your staff through an award, hourly rate, EBA, whatever the case is, and you'd like to actually export now your timesheets to Xero to perform a payroll function, you can now do that, which is great. Keep in mind for anyone from New Zealand joining us from across the ditch, that is coming towards the end of the year, early next year. So exact timing still to be confirmed. Australia, it is working though, which is great. Now the steps for doing that again is relatively quite simple. When you come into your timesheeting screen, we'll jump in here. We can see here that we've got a few hours. This is a demo and test environment, everyone. So just a reminder, there isn't too much data there, particularly from a timesheet perspective, but your steps will be relatively the same. Now, when you go to export to Xero, you'll notice here that when a pay run's there and available has been created, you'll be able to select the appropriate and applicable pay run. Now, keep in mind, similar to the old, what you're exporting across the timesheets against the individual employee in Xero is very much explicit to the total hours. So if you do have award interpretation, you got things that complicate your payroll, such as allowances or individual agreements. Just keep in mind that that interpretation, WorkflowMAX isn't a payroll system or an award interpretation system or payroll interpretation system, I should say. So you'll get a summary of hours, but you'll have to break those up if somebody, say, accrues double time or time and a half, for instance. Now, it will ask you each time just to reconfirm and double check your mapping settings. So because I've connected to my demo file, I've just got some of these random employees there. So you'll match, obviously, typically the correct person through to the correct person, for instance. Quick question that came through around Xero leave forms and Xero. If somebody add leave in Xero, can this autofill timesheets in WorkflowMAX? Unfortunately not. No, the process there, great question. So just to clarify that question, somebody just did ask that there whether or not Xero leave does filter across. So if a leave is submitted through the Xero app by an employee or is submitted otherwise, that doesn't filter across back into WorkflowMAX, unfortunately. Again, that's kind of getting into probably more of an award or time and attendance software. And look, watch this space because there's be some exciting things happening then. So if you are a business or environment that does have things like leave instances, award interpretation, EBAs, etc., there is an interesting potential integration that's coming. I'm not going to say too much though, because I don't want to get in too much trouble. But what you do in that workflow. So particularly with if you're using capacity planning, just to finish off that question, you will be able to, if you've say got an internal job that you call leave, literally get that person to put in a timesheet for that leave period, because then it'll block them out, mark that as capacity reducing. So then it doesn't impact their performance if that's relevant to their KPIs, but it blocks out that time so you can't, you know that that staff's utilized through leave that particular instance. So just a bit of a handy tip there. So once you've gone through, obviously after you've done this once, you typically don't have to update it again, and then you would hit export and follow the prompts from there. Now, where that will show directly in payroll will be in timesheets, and that will all filter and go through to the correct person there for you to perform your pay run as per usual. So that's a really, really interesting one. I will go through just a little bit more in terms of that purchase order relationship in just a moment. Just probably want to circle back on that Xero integration piece. I know I kind of skipped over that part after we did the general settings. So I just want to take probably a few moments to really step through that Xero mapping piece and then go back into purchase orders, if I may. Sales orders and purchase orders, again, when we talk about the general ledger relationship, there's three different levels of the integration. So again, just to touch on, we've got the default level of integration, which is our obviously our nominal items that we set up when we look at our Xero integration, and go set up. And we've got our defaults. So that's the first level. So WorkflowMAX will check there first. When you go to send a sales invoice or you're receiving a bill against a purchase order, we'll go, great. We've got our default counts. Awesome. So we have our next level down. Now the next level down will be directly in our org settings. Go to general, go to jobs, will be our category level. Now, our job categories at the moment, we've got aged care, commercial, education, health. So when we go into one of those categories, we'll see that we've got a few options there, very similar to what we touched on before. So again, explicit region, explicit other option there for our other category that can filter through. So again, based on tracking categories, you might have, professional services might have region or discipline, region being the first tracking category, discipline being the second. So then your job categories will be aligned by region and discipline so that every time a job is being created, again, what you're doing is setting that default mapping to your tracking category, so you're getting that reporting coming through. So that's a really easy one to start. So if you're a bit lost in tracking categories, again, happy to chat afterwards. But the main thing is really just keep in mind to keep it simple, then go into more detail there. Once you've set, obviously, your category level for tracking categories, if it applies. Now, if you don't use tracking categories, feel free just to leave it blank. Again, your export information, these information will appear in invoices, so be cautious of that. Many of us won't want to enable that setting. Some of us may. Again, we're then defaulting into what our default sales account is and our default cost of sales for that particular category. So again, we've sent a sales invoice or we're receiving a bill, which was about to get pushed across to Xero. WorkflowMAX will check. Do we have a default? Yes. Next level down, does a job category have a default Xero tracking or default income or cost of sale? Yes or no? If it does have that, awesome. Great. The third level, so if we're looking at it from a hierarchy perspective, we can have the default and only the default. We can apply specific parameters around a job category. The very granular and detailed level of that Xero integration will sit very much at a task and cost level. So for many of us, this is one that may apply. It also may not. Keep in mind as well that you might have some tasks or costs that when you invoice them, you want them to be an explicit to an explicit sales account code or cost account code. So you might apply a group of tasks or group of costs to explicit sales or cost of sale, cost of or expense code. But then for others, you leave them blank. So WorkflowMAX will go, oh, okay, we might be invoicing AEC consultation. There is an explicit account code, for instance, on that. So we'll just go, is there actually an account code on the job category that that invoice relates to? If not, we'll go up to default. So see how the levels start to really come together nicely there. So again, when we're looking at tasks, we can really set that default tax type as well. We've got obviously categories again, and the default income account, which sits there as well. You note that there is an expense account that's a created against a task, and that's because typically tasks are only used for timesheeting, so only be costs that you'll allocate an expense code to. Probably coming through as well to our costs. So again, general settings, tasks. The other way of doing it is in bulk. So this accounting interface is really handy. So if you are mapping directly at a line item level task or costs, this can be a great way to search and filter. So I might say that everything that's got the word construction in it is going to be allocated to this particular income account, this particular tracking category, this particular tracking category. Again, don't need to have tracking categories if you don't use them. Really, really handy to think about though if you don't. Costs. Getting to the cost side of things. Oh, time. I need more time on this WorkflowMAX team. Could talk for hours. Hopefully everyone's having a good time though. Feel free to grab another coffee if need be. I do want to touch on this particular element as well. So cost very similar to what we did with tasks earlier. There is the bulk allocation, which is really handy. And you can see here, I've actually already allocated some sales and cost of goods account already there to some of these cost line items. So again, if you start applying sales account codes and expense codes to a cost line item or task, don't feel like you have to do it for any. This is really depending on your workflow and what relationship you need between, the GL codes in Xero compared with what interactions happen in WorkflowMAX. So just keep in mind those levels in the hierarchy. You don't need to use all of them. I'd suggest starting at the default level and then looking back to your GL and going, great, what more detail do I need? Do I need to then think about categories? How are my job categories set up to empower my GL reporting or my GL structure, which I have? And then tracking structure as well. So it's a good conversation to have with your accountant as well as potentially somebody like me who can help map out that best relationship there. But then obviously below that, you've got the explicit line item relationship with tasks and costs, which is really cool. So once you've gone through that details, again, that purchase order process, one that I do want to touch on, I'll bring up that job and then I'm going to run into easy bills and some other expense stuff, which is really cool. The job that we're talking about and playing with is this one here. So what I'll do is jump back in and we want to raise a purchase order. Again, purchase orders can also be raised from the purchases tab up the top here as well. Just coming in, selecting that. Description is optional, but we'll just put one in anyway. Delivery address. If we had any pre-existing costs on the job sitting there, we could pick those up and obviously automatically apply them to that purchase order. I'll just add one quickly here. Now, just to remind everyone, in the new versus the old, we've got this awesome thing called cost type, so stock and service. So if you physically receipt goods and you want as part of your process to be able to receipt a stock item but not receipt the invoice, this is the one to pick. Now, I did do a webinar on this a few weeks ago, so if you've got any questions around that, make sure you watch that one. But we actually might do the stock. Let's do two. Now that we've done two, we can go through issue and receipt all in one step. So obviously you've got the ability to receipt, you've got the ability to send. Now what I want to do is I want to receive one. We're going to receive one, and we can see it's partially received and still awaiting a bill. Now we might receive the other goods, or we might receive a bill for that first delivery run. So again, this is where that mapping relationship comes really important. Because I've got a particular explicit account code against that, that's going to go to the correct GL code once we receipt this bill against this partial receipt. So I do want to select that receipt. It's receiving one. And we've got that stock receipt 1 sitting there. And we've got the invoice ID, which can be anything today because we're in a test environment. And then good. We've got stock receipt, stock receipt. Now, as a final step, and for instance, that might be just leaving it there. Again, that bill will come across directly into Xero. Mapping will then be applicable in the GL specific to exactly what we need to map that across to. So that will then come across directly as a bill. So for instance, we might need to add another bill there. Say we've got the bill early this time, which can sometimes happen. Typically receive stock first and invoice. But then we might want to add some additional items. We might get a freight or a duty invoice after the fact. So we can obviously do stuff like that as well. So keep in mind, we don't, even if we've got a stocked item, we can just receipt invoices in stock at any given time based on what actually happens in real life. Cool. So again, mapping relationship that will come directly across. That'll be sitting in your bills. We'll check that in just a moment. Now, one of the things just to really note as well is that lump sum sales invoices, so obviously that's a premium feature only. So that's when you're doing obviously lump sum invoices, so retainer invoices or recurring invoices, you're creating an invoice in Xero, and that's then syncing across to WorkflowMAX. A quick reference on how to do that one. So we've got an invoice here that we're going to create from scratch. Now we go new invoice. And we might go to, let's just pick a job. We'll come to our Xero job. I'll just pick up what that job number was. So the secret is, everyone, obviously, when you're doing that job number, when you're generating that invoice directly from Xero, is to reference that job number. So we'll just pick that up. We'll go Xero invoice test, mark due date today, reference. Again, this is where you correspond what your settings are back. We want to make sure that whatever the reference field is in that Xero setting down the bottom is what's going to appear on that line item when we push it back. So obviously description, we can put whatever we want on these line items to send through to the customer. We'll put 25. Now here's where we plant that reference number. Now just keep in mind when you're doing stuff like this, when you're syncing, see how then, you may not have noticed, I'll just do that thing again, but when I actually copied across that job number, I accidentally had a space at the front. So just take a moment when you're doing this process that the job number is just the job number. You don't have like a hidden space in there. Again, approve and email. Yep, I'll just send that to test. It's going to bounce back. And then that will come through there. And again, that reference number is what's going to be the driver. So if you use the reference number for something else at the moment, which is quite often the case in different workflow environments, I'd recommend thinking about where else you can put it. Creating another line item in an invoice is the easiest way to do it. So if you've got an actual purchase order number that you need to show a customer, you're getting the invoice out the door, just add it as additional line item to that invoice and get it going. Great. Sales invoice payments we've touched on. Chart of accounts we've touched on, and the 3 levels of integrations. Tracking categories we've touched on. Again, I could spend quite a little bit of time. You've got quite a bit of, actually, I just saw a question there, which is a really good one. Tasks don't seem to allow negative quantity. So tasks don't have a negative quantity. What you're using, so for discounts and credit notes, all you're doing is doing a negative number as a cost. You're not doing it as a task. So if you need to do a negative quantity, for whatever reason, you're not doing it as a task, you're doing it as a cost for discounts or credit notes, just as an FYI. So really good question there around why you can't do negatives as a task. Keep in mind, guys, that fundamentally tasks are built to be the thing that we budget time against. So it's where we put timesheets against. For all your transactional activity, credit notes, discounts, user cost. Negative cost, of course. Now, going through, I'm just being conscious of time because there's 1 or 2 things I really want to get through. Just touching on, obviously, supplier bills that we enter into Xero won't come back into WorkflowMAX. So purchase order, So that relationship for sending a bill will only go back. So we can't create a bill and then shoot it back, unfortunately. Bills created in Xero expenses. So bills created in Xero expenses will also not come through either. And money spend transactions neither as well. I've actually spoken to the team quite a lot about this one, particularly with bills. So bills and Xero being able to actually pick up miscellaneous bills and shoot them back. That's something that's part of our ideas board brainstorming that the team and I always talk about with WorkflowMAX team, I should say. So that's really exciting to come, potentially, if I can twist some arms, if anyone's listening. Obviously, Xero configuration, we've already gone through setting data to the right place in Xero. Just coming back on some of the high level stuff before we go into easy bills, which is I want to really spend some time on. So how to sync. So obviously the invoicing sync is a place to go, particularly if we need to troubleshoot any items. So just a reminder that you do have that Xero export feature where you can click, drag, resync. And again, soon to come will be a little option button here, I imagine. Depending on how many coffees the developers have had, we might see when that comes through, maybe hopefully in the next few weeks, it will be just hide from list or remove. So every time if you've got, quite a few that have had sync issues and you're not looking to repost them, because you've dealt with them otherwise, you can just hide them from that screen there. And obviously with that numbering piece, just a reminder that numbering piece, if you are driving it directly from WorkflowMAX, you've got the ability to update that number sequence there. Your number sequence though, again, if you come into your Xero settings and just bring that up there, integrations, set up integrations, we go Xero invoice number sequencing. We don't need to worry about obviously applying the correct setup of invoice number sequencing in that WorkflowMAX setting. So WorkflowMAX, obviously we need to worry about that edit number sequence there. So if you are changing where you get that invoice number sequencing from, particularly if you're going from WorkflowMAX to Xero, or more specifically Xero to WorkflowMAX, just be careful that you're not running into a duplicate situation there. Cool. Purchase order receipts, something I've been really wanting to get to. So purchase order receipts, when we receipt the bill in a purchase order, it goes across. But what about environments that have got a lot of receipts that come through and have a lot of expenses that come through? How do you handle the volume? Surely we don't want to go in each and every time against the job, create a purchase order, because at the moment you might be creating a purchase order, particularly if it's an expense and it's a bill that you were then pushed across to Xero, depending on your workflow. You might just be putting in a cost item and not creating a purchase order and then sending that bill directly through to Xero through one of the other applications. The Easy Bills integration here is a beautiful thing. Now, again, being conscious of time, but want to step in through, when you are, if those that don't know, Easy Bills is expense handling and does integrate directly through to WorkflowMAX and Xero. So say if you've got expenses on jobs, purchase orders on jobs, and other things that you want to receipt directly back, really, really cool piece of kit to look at. Now, when you do set up, I've just got some really handy tips and hints, particularly if you're going to download a trial of Easy Bills. Come in, download a trial, put in your name details, obviously your email address, being really, really important there, your password, but default integration is we want to hit WorkflowMAX there. Now, the reason is when we do that and create an actual account, what will happen there is, and this is Easy Bills, by the way, everyone. So we've done a little bit. There has been a webinar on Easy Bills, so I can't go into the setup too much, unfortunately, based on time. But you'll notice here that there is a actual there's an actual WorkflowMAX workflow here, which is cool, which is created. So Easy Bills relies on this concept called workflow. So what happens when a document is either emailed or when it's uploaded directly to Easy Bills? What are the steps? Now, this looks a little bit confusing. There is quite a bit of help modules there to just kind of give you a bit of an instance. Again, welcome to contact me if you are interested in Easy Bills and how it works. I'm happy to go into a lot more detail, but by default, this workflow is actually created. So all the hard work's done. If you just want to send bills directly through to WorkflowMAX and then pick up the actual invoice receipt or whatever the case is, push that in for that bill to then be sent to Xero. I like doing it a different way though. And again, this is very much workflow dependent, But when I first provision a Easy Bills account, I'll think about all those purchase orders and the steps, costs that hit a job, taxis, coffees. We might be hiring gear for a job that we're doing. We're not raising a purchase order for that. We just know that's a cost that's going to be borne against the job. But I also want it when I receipt that to automatically go to Xero so I can pay the thing. Cool. Or mark it as reconciled if you've already paid for it. So what I do here is if I create a new workflow, so when you sign up for Easy Bills, what you're doing is you're going to duplicate an existing workflow and you're going to pick the WorkflowMAX workflow that's been created by default by Easy Bills. When you do that, hit create, you'll be asked to put in a name and you can call it whatever you want. I've just called it WorkflowMAX by Xero. And what that means is that that exact same workflow is duplicated. You'll notice here, and this is where you can refer back to the recording, you'll notice here that we didn't in that original workflow have a Xero export 146. So that 146, Xero export 146, you'll click and drag to where I see it. So when you click it, it's not allowing me to do it because you can see the warning message just at the top there that said the node already exists. So again, you'll just click and drag that. Again, node already exists. But if I was just doing another one, so under the WorkflowMAX export, you'd pick up that Xero export 146, drop that there. I've already done it, of course. So I just hit save and exit. And now I've actually got a pre-built workflow. So when I receipt a bill or purchase order in, it's going through to both. So I'll quickly do one so everyone can see. Before I do that, I'll actually show what it looks like afterwards. So now that I've actually uploaded this receipt here that I've done earlier, I have got obviously a breakdown there, which is cool. I can obviously view the image, view the document itself, but I can go to the Xero bill so I can see where that bill has already been entered via Easy Bills here, ready to be treated, ready to be paid. And we've got a reference back to Easy Bills. But awesomely, I've already got it in WorkflowMAX. Now, I did want to take a moment to touch on this because this is one that I run into all the time. Some of your workflow will be very much driven by being able to just send your receipts, expenses directly into WorkflowMAX, then pick up that invoice and then receipt it in WorkflowMAX to push it across. Because keep in mind, we're dealing with a three-way sync. But if we do this particular workflow, it means that we don't have to receipt that purchase order directly in. We don't have to add the bill because we've already pushed that corresponding invoice across. So I can spend quite a lot of time talking about that, but just something to keep in mind. If I hadn't done the WorkflowMAX to Xero workflow, I can simply just push it through to WorkflowMAX as per that default integration or workflow there, I should say. And then I'll just be picking up the invoice and receiving it back. The benefit of doing it this way, though, is you're getting the best of both worlds. You're getting the attachment, you're getting everything sent across to Xero when it needs to be, so accounts can treat it. And then conversely, WorkflowMAX is there as well, so it can be treated appropriately too. And then it's right and ready to go. So really, really, really cool option there to go through if you are considering it Easy Bills. Now, the reason is, as you can see here, that's all been pushed across originally to the correct purchase order. So it's referencing the purchase order reference. We haven't had to raise a purchase order. It's already there. We've all marked as actual and that can be invoiced and dealt with appropriately. So that's just a quick point there on Easy Bills. So Easy Bills, obviously, the syncing will happen exactly when you tell it to and when it's approved. For normal bills, so when you are receiving a bill against a particular purchase order, it will happen at the point in which you fully or partially or fully receive. So whenever we add a bill, that will then get pushed across to the correct or into your bills with the correct GL account. So again, this is where take a few moments after we finish today, have a think about your Xero integration. And again, for instance, if we've set an explicit expense code against this particular cost item, it will go to the correct GL code. So again, we'll add bill, put in the invoice ID, put in, already invoiced the original one item of that. So we'll just say we've got a freight charge that's come in. Let's call it $250. Cool. And that's the purchase order bill that's sent across. Cool. And again, back on the Xero side, we'll come through and we'll have a look at that coming in as well. So that original one should be there. Go to bills. Now this is where double checking the settings in terms of what's being sent through is really, really important. So this is the one that I sent originally. Obviously, it takes a few moments to sync through. That API call, I believe, is still 1 or 2 a minute, as mentioned. It does come through pretty quickly, though, but you can see here from that original build that I received, we've got the test. We've got the information that we've preferenced in the Xero integration settings. So I put in the job number, obviously the name of the job, the purchase order number, purchase order description, and the item itself. So again, that's come through, which is cool. And we've got obviously the history there received through API from WorkflowMAX by Blue Rock. So just keep in mind there's a little bit there in the content to get through, but obviously that point in time at which we add the bill is when the bill gets sent across. I absolutely love that Easy Bills workflow. I'm hoping that for some of you that's really useful. Again, there's a few things to kind of map out depending on your workflow requirements with accounting, the accounting side of things. Obviously, we've touched on the syncing, that being now both ways. Troubleshooting, invoice numbering. Again, there was a release that was done that should troubleshoot a lot of those items. Struck through rate, I'm rarely seeing that at all at the moment. Again, for many of you that migrated from the old to the new, that was something that was there. If you are seeing that and it's struck through, just a reminder that you come into invoices, you come in, let's just pick up a draft invoice quickly. And I don't have any strike throughs, but you just change it to whatever the appropriate tax type is and go from there. And how to handle sync errors. So with syncing, one of the awesome things that you'll note now, particularly if you have some recent sync issues, again, most users aren't seeing those anymore. There's actually been, it's really, really working slick. I know there might be a few out there that are running into still some concerns. Obviously, raise a ticket if after following these you aren't seeing an option there. Quite often, if there is a sync, you've done the troubleshooting steps, simply deleting that invoice, reissuing it will solve the problem 9 times out of 10. Again, most users aren't experiencing any significant syncing issues that come there. Obviously, your sync log is one place that you can refer to it to see these timesheets are synced. Have sync failed because I haven't set up ILA correctly against that pay code. Generally speaking, though, because you've set up your payroll correctly, that will all sync through. That's just a really handy spot though to check the sync log, particularly for your timesheet exporting. For your invoices though, coming in, export, there is where we want to go through. So we're obviously coming into your failed payments. Now, obviously, if you hover over it, that's where you'll be able to see what the issue is. So coming in, we can see that's default tax type. Then we can look at particularly updating that default tax type against the client and going from there. So we go into the client and go from there. So if I just hover over some of these, let's see if there's any others that are coming through. These ones are all raised quite a while ago and obviously being test environment. But yeah, the tax type of the current invoice default tax rate. So again, this might be one, because I've changed what the default tax rate is. This might be one I'd either test to resync or I'd actually just cancel, delete, and then roll through another invoice. So hopefully that helps everyone. Just touching on any of the other options. Just a reminder with premium, because we are a little bit over time, the invoice syncing into WorkflowMAX from Xero, really, really good one to have a look at, and obviously reoccurring invoices and retainers. So if you are looking at reoccurring invoices, just a reminder that in Xero, you've got the ability to set up your reoccurring invoices or repeating invoice by hitting repeat, repeating invoices, and then put in the reference number, the project number. So that means every time a new invoice is created, it will go to that project number. So particularly for your monthly retainers, really good for keeping up to date record of financials as you go. So hopefully that was really handy, guys. Apologies, a few minutes over time. Again, there's a lot to go through today, so that hopefully there's some tidbits and nitbits in there that you really enjoyed. Again, really appreciate everyone taking their time. I know we're getting so close to Christmas and it's always a super busy time of year, but really love doing these sessions. So thank you so much for those that have obviously stayed through. My contact details, appreciating the fact that there's a lot in here, a lot to go through. please do reach out and get in touch because I'd love to obviously see how I can help with any specific items that you're running through. And particularly, quite a few of the items we touched on today are very much workflow contextual. So, a big shout out to the WorkflowMAX team in the background. Thank you so much for supporting in the back end as well. And thank you, everyone, for joining. Look forward to seeing you next time. So, really appreciate it, everyone. We'll see you soon.